town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the world, or at least that is how it felt to anyone who had ever ridden through its single dusty street, lined with leaning wooden buildings and sun-cracked porches where old men sat whittling away the hours as though time itself had forgotten this little corner of the frontier. It was the kind of place where the wind carried more conversation than the people did, where tumbleweeds rolled through the gaps between the general store and the livery stable, like ghosts searching for somewhere better to haunt, and where every soul who called it home had a story carved into the lines of their face, whether they chose to tell it or not. Into this forgotten town on a morning when the sun hung low and copper-colored over the eastern ridge, rode a man who would change everything, though not a single person watching him approach, from behind their dusty windows, would have believed it at first glance. His name was Silas Kane, and he looked like the kind of man the world had chewed up and spit into the dirt more times than anyone could count. His boots were scuffed beyond recognition. His hat was bent and stained with rings of old sweat. His shirt was patched in 3 places, with mismatched fabric, and the horse beneath him was a tired-looking sorrel mare, whose ribs showed faintly beneath a dull coat. He carried no saddlebags of worth, no gleaming pistol on his hip, no silver spurs or fine leather gloves, and when he dismounted in front of the saloon and tied his horse to the rail with a fraying rope, the few people who noticed him immediately looked away as though poverty itself were contagious. What none of them knew, what no living soul in Caldwell could have guessed, was that Silas Kane owned more land than any 5 ranchers in the territory combined, that his family name was stamped on deeds stretching from the banks of the Cimarron River to the high plains of Colorado, and that back in a bank vault in Kansas City sat a fortune large enough to build this entire town 10 times over. Silas Kane was one of the wealthiest men west of the Mississippi, and he had ridden into Caldwell dressed in rags on purpose, because he was searching for something his money had never been able to buy. He had tried before, 3 times in fact, to find a woman who would stand beside him and share his life, but each time the courtship had begun with admiration for his wealth, and ended with a hollowness in his chest that no amount of gold could fill. The first woman, a banker's daughter in Topeka, had loved his parlor and his carriages, but could not remember the color of his eyes when asked by her own sister. The second, a young widow in Abilene, had wept with joy when he proposed, but spent every evening thereafter counting his holdings in a leather ledger she kept beneath her pillow, as though the numbers mattered more than the man who earned them. The third had simply vanished one night, with a strongbox containing $6,000 and a note that read only "thank you," which were the 2 cruelest words Silas had ever read in his life. After that, he had sat alone on the porch of his grand ranch house, staring out at 10,000 acres of grassland stretching to the horizon, and had felt for the first time that he was the poorest man alive, because he owned everything except the one thing that mattered. So he had conceived a plan that his foreman Hector had called foolish and his attorney in Kansas City had called insane, but that Silas himself called the only honest idea he had ever had. He would strip away every visible sign of his wealth, ride into a town where nobody knew his name, and present himself as nothing more than a broke drifter looking for work, and maybe looking for love, and he would see whether any woman in this world could want him for nothing more than the man he was beneath, the money. That is how he found himself pushing through the creaking doors of the dusty Diamond Saloon in Caldwell on that copper-colored morning, ordering the cheapest whiskey on the shelf, and sitting alone at a corner table, while the town moved around him like a river flowing past a stone. Within days, Silas had found work mucking stalls at the livery stable, owned by a thick-armed man named Garrett Howe, who paid him 50 cents a day and a place to sleep in the hayloft, which Silas accepted with a grateful nod, even though back home his stables were finer than most men's houses. He kept his head down, spoke little, worked hard, and watched the people of Caldwell with quiet, careful eyes, learning their rhythms and their hearts, the way a man reads the land before deciding where to build. The town had its share of women, some married and busy with children, some widowed and guarded, and a handful of younger women whose eyes occasionally drifted toward any new man, the way sunflowers track the sun. Among these was Clara Dunhill, the daughter of the mercantile owner, a sharp-tongued beauty with golden hair, who wore imported lace even on weekdays, and who noticed Silas only long enough to wrinkle her nose at his dusty clothes before turning away. There was also Bet Granger, the saloon owner's niece, a lively redhead with a laugh that could fill a room, but whose warmth seemed to dim noticeably whenever she learned a man had nothing of value in his pockets. Silas tested the waters carefully, offering small kindnesses and conversation to every woman he encountered, and he watched with a quiet ache as one after another they measured him by his appearance and found him wanting. Clara openly told her father within Silas's hearing that she would sooner marry a fence post than a man who smelled like horse sweat and owned nothing but a tired mare. And Bet smiled sweetly, but always found a reason to excuse herself when Silas lingered too long at the saloon bar, her eyes scanning past him toward the cattlemen with silver belt buckles. But there was one woman in Caldwell who did not look through Silas as though he were made of glass, and the first time he saw her his breath caught in a way that money had never once made it catch. Her name was Elara Finch, and she was the gentlest and most quietly beautiful creature he had ever laid eyes upon. She was not loud. She was not adorned with lace or jewels. She did not command attention when she walked into a room, but she carried a grace about her that was like the first pale light of dawn, sliding over a still meadow, the kind of beauty that does not shout, but instead whispers so softly that only a paying attention heart can hear it. Elara lived alone in a tiny house at the far end of town, with a garden she tended with her own hands, and she earned her living doing laundry and mending for the townsfolk, work that left her fingers rough and her dresses plain, but that she performed without complaint and without bitterness. She was 24 years old and had buried both her parents within the same cruel winter 2 years prior, her father taken by fever and her mother following just 19 days later, as though her heart simply refused to beat in a world without him. And since that devastating season, Elara had carried her grief quietly and had built her small life with a dignity that made even the harshest gossips in town speak softly when her name arose. The first time Silas spoke to E, Lara was outside the general store on a windy afternoon, when he saw her struggling to carry a basket of folded linens while the gusts kept trying to tear them from her arms, and without thinking he stepped forward and caught a white sheet just before it sailed into the mud and handed it back to her with a small nod. She looked up at him with eyes the color of rain-washed sage, and instead of scanning his clothes or measuring his worth the way every other woman in town had done, she simply smiled and said, "Thank you." That was kind. And in those 5 words, Silas heard something he had not heard in years. Sincerity so pure, it almost hurt. Over the following weeks, he found excuses to be near her. Not in a forceful way, but in the gentle orbit of a man who has found the sun he wants to circle. He offered to carry water from the well to her little house. He mended a broken hinge on her garden gate without being asked, and each time she thanked him warmly and insisted on repaying him with whatever small thing she had, A bowl of stew made from her garden vegetables, a cup of coffee on her porch, as the evening painted the sky in shades of amber. She never asked what he owned. She never asked where he came from, and she never once looked at his patched shirt with anything resembling pity or contempt. Instead, she asked him questions that reached deeper. Questions like what makes you smile when nobody is watching, and do you ever talk to the stars when the night gets too quiet? And Silas found himself answering with the honesty he had never offered another human being, because for the first time, someone wanted to know him, and not his holdings. The weeks turned, and the cottonwood trees along the dry creek shed their white fluff like summer snow, drifting through the streets of Caldwell. And Silas felt something growing inside his chest that was more terrifying and more beautiful than anything his wealth had ever given him. He was falling in love with Elara Finch, not the careful, calculated kind of love that comes from weighing advantages, but the reckless, trembling kind that makes a man lie awake in a hayloft, staring at the rafters, with her voice echoing in his mind like a melody he never wants to end. She had a way of listening that made him feel like the only person in the world, tilting her head slightly and holding his gaze with those sage-colored eyes, as though every word he spoke mattered deeply. And she had a laugh that came rarely, but when it did, it was so genuine and so full of warmth that it could have melted snow off a mountain peak in January. But Silas carried a weight that grew heavier with each passing day, because the deception that had seemed so clever when he conceived it now felt like a stone pressing against his conscience. He was lying to the one person who deserved his truth, and the irony was not lost on him that he had come to Caldwell to find honest love and had built it upon a foundation of dishonesty. He wrestled with this silently, telling himself he needed more time to be certain. But the real fear lurking beneath that excuse was darker and simpler. He was terrified that telling Elara the truth would change the way she looked at him, that the money would build a wall between them, just as it had with every woman before her. Or worse, that she would feel betrayed by his lie and walk away from him entirely. While Silas wrestled with his conscience, the town itself began to shift around him in ways he had not anticipated. Clara Dunhill's father, old Morris Dunhill, who owned the Mercantile, had begun to struggle financially, and rumors swirled that he owed a significant debt to a cattleman named Royce Phelps, who operated a sprawling ranch south of town, and who had a reputation for collecting what was owed to him with a coldness that left no room for mercy. Royce Phelps rode into Caldwell one Saturday with 3 of his men, all of them sitting tall on expensive horses with silver-mounted saddles, and he made it known in the saloon that Morris Dunhill had until the end of the month to pay his debt, or Phelps would take ownership of the Mercantile and the Dunhill house and everything in it. Clara, who had always carried herself like a woman above the concerns of ordinary people, was suddenly pale and frightened, and Silas watched from a distance as the town buzzed with tension, because Royce Phelps was not a man people stood against. It was during this turmoil that something happened which tested every heart in Caldwell and revealed the truth about each one. Royce Phelps, who was a widower of 45 with a jaw like an anvil, and eyes that calculated value the way a butcher eyes livestock, set his gaze upon Elara Finch during one of his visits to town. He saw her walking from the well, with a bucket in each hand, her dark hair catching the afternoon light, her movements graceful despite the weight she carried, and something shifted behind those cold, calculating eyes. He asked around about her, learned she was alone and poor and unspoken, for, the very next day, he appeared at her garden gate on his tall black horse and announced with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted that he found agreeable and wished to make her his wife. He told her plainly that he could give her a fine house with real glass windows, dresses ordered from St. Louis, and a life free from the drudgery of washing other people's clothes. And he said it all with the tone of a man presenting terms of a business deal, rather than a proposal born from the heart. Elara stood in her garden with dirt on her hands and looked up at this powerful man on his powerful horse, and in a voice as steady and calm as a creek flowing over smooth stones, she told him that she appreciated his offer, but that she could not marry a man she did not love, and that love was not something she could will into existence simply because the offer was generous. Royce Phelps stared at her for a long moment, as though he had never heard the word no before, and was trying to determine what language it belonged to. And then he turned his horse and rode away without another word. But the set of his shoulders carried a warning that everyone who saw him leave understood instinctively. When Silas heard about the encounter from Garrett Howe at the livery stable that evening, his hands went still on the pitchfork he was holding, and a fear he had not felt in years crawled up his spine because he knew men like Royce Phelps, and he knew that rejection was a wound such men treated with cruelty rather than reflection. The retaliation came not with violence, but with something almost worse. Royce Phelps quietly informed the women of Caldwell, who sent their laundry to Elara, that anyone who continued to employ her services would find themselves on the wrong side of his considerable influence, and within a week, Elara's small income dried up like a puddle in August. She said nothing about it to anyone, did not complain, did not weep in public. But Silas noticed that her garden received even more attention than before, because it was now her only source of sustenance. And he noticed, too, that her dresses, already plain, were being patched with the same quiet skill she applied to everyone else's mending. One evening, Illis brought her a sack of flour he had purchased with nearly all of his livery wages, and when he set it on her porch, she looked at him with those sage eyes, shining with a gratitude that went far beyond the flour itself, and she said, "Silas, you have less than I do. Why, would you give me what little you have?" And he answered, "Because what I have means nothing if I cannot share it with the person who matters most." She was quiet for a long time after that, sitting on her porch step with her hands folded in her lap, and then she said something that broke his heart wide open. She said, "I have been alone for 2 years, and I have learned that loneliness is not the absence of people, but the absence of being truly known. And when I am with you, I feel known, and that is worth more than anything anyone has ever offered me." Silas sat down beside her and watched the stars appear, one by one above the darkening plain, and knew that he could not carry his secret any longer, because this woman had just handed him her entire heart wrapped in honesty, and he was holding his own heart behind a lie. The next morning, Silas asked Elara to walk with him along the dry creek bed, outside of town, and beneath the wide open sky with the cottonwood fluff drifting around them like fragments of a dream, he told her everything. He told her about the ranch, and the land, and the fortune in the Kansas City bank. He told her about the 3 women who had loved his money and left his soul empty. He told her about the plan to come to Caldwell as a poor man and find someone who could love him without knowing what he had. And then he told her that he was sorry, that the deception had been born from pain, but that it was still a deception, and she deserved to know. Elara stopped walking and stood very still, and for a terrible stretching moment, Silas believed he had lost her. But when she turned to face him, there were tears on her cheeks and a fire in her eyes that he had never seen before. And she said, "I am not crying because you are rich, and I am not crying because you lied. I am crying because you lied." I am crying because you just trusted me with the truth, and that is the bravest thing anyone has ever done for me." She stepped closer and took his rough hands in her rough hands, and she said, "Silas Kane, I fell in love with a man who fixed my garden gate and carried my water and gave me his last sack of flour. And that is the man I love, and if he happens to own 10,000 acres, then I will love him there too. But it is him I love, not the acres." Silas felt something break loose inside his chest, something that had been locked tight for years, and standing in that dry creek bed with cottonwood fluff swirling around them, he understood, for the first time, what it meant to be truly wealthy. When word spread through Caldwell about who Silas Kane really was, the reactions told their own story. Clara Dunhill appeared at the livery stable in her finest dress, with a sudden warmth in her eyes that had been conspicuously absent for months, and Bet Granger sent word through her uncle that she would be delighted to have coffee with Silas at his earliest convenience. But Silas looked past them both with a quiet smile, because he had already found what he came for. As for Royce Phelps, when he learned that the shabby stable hand he had dismissed without a second glance was in fact a man whose holdings dwarfed his own, he rode out of Caldwell and did not return, and the debts he held over Morris Dunhill quietly disappeared, because even a cold man knows when the wind has shifted against him. Silas and Alara were married in the small wooden church at the center of town on a September afternoon, when the light was golden and the air smelled of sage, and the whole town gathered not because of his wealth, but because somewhere along the way, the quiet love between a man in patched clothes and a woman with dirt on her hands had reminded every single one of them what was real and what was not. Years later, when travelers passed through the Grand Cane Ranch and saw the beautiful woman tending a garden beside the big house, even though she had a dozen people who could have done it for her, they sometimes asked why she still worked the soil with her own hands. And Alara would smile that gentle smile and say, "Because this is who I was when he loved me, and this is who I will always be." And that simple answer carried more truth in it than all the gold in all the vaults in all the world. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider sharing it with your friends who might appreciate a heartfelt Western tale. We would also love to know where you're watching from. Leave the name of your city in the comments so we can see how far our stories travel across the world.